Hello, everyone. We're so happy to have you here with us on the Stronger Marriage webinar, produced by the Utah Marriage Commission, hosted by Utah State University. I'm Alexis Alcott. I use she, her pronouns, and we're excited to have you join us today. In today's webinar, we're so excited to be joined by Andreas Brown, who is a queer and non-binary mezcla bella, or beautiful mix, of a father who immigrated from Guatemala and a mother of Western European descent. First and foremost, they are a healer, as well as a licensed marriage and family therapist. They have worked in a range of therapy settings, including school-based therapy, nonprofits, college counseling centers, training clinics, and adjunct teaching. Currently, they have an AVP of clinical services at Encircle, a nonprofit that provides mental health services for LGBTQIA+ youth, people, and families here in Utah. Throughout their career, they focused on better understanding queer identity development among collectivist and community-focused cultures, as well as healing acute, systemic, and intergenerational trauma for QT/BIPOC people. They focus on reclaiming healing practices and have been trained in a variety of healing modalities, including EMDR, psychedelic-assisted therapy for PTSD, Curandismo, and radical healing for QT/BIPOC communities. They believe they are truly whole when in connection and community. Through teaching, training, education, and advocacy, they seek to bridge the gap between research and clinical practice. In today's webinar, we'll cover topics like the unique hurdles faced by non-traditional relationships, creating a welcoming environment where everyone feels safe, understanding the role of the self of the therapist, practical ways to improve LGBTQIA relationships, intersectional approaches to cultural attuned care, and more. We're excited to hear your questions and what you have to add to today's webinar. We will be doing today's webinar a little bit differently with our Q&A. The chat will be turned off like usual in our webinars, so this is really not the best place to reach either me or Andreas. The place to do that is through the Q&A function that's found at your bottom of your screens. You'll go ahead and click in that button and ask your question. At any point during the presentation, please ask your questions. I'll be coming in and out of Andreas's presentation to ask whatever questions you have for today. We will still have a short Q&A at the end of today's presentation, but we want to be interacting with you all throughout this. So please share your questions and your insights. If you joined us today for the CEU credit, make sure to stay on until the end of the presentation. The survey needed for your credit will automatically load onto the screen, and then you'll receive an email from the Utah Marriage Commission with your certificate. If for some reason it doesn't load on, please still reach out back to us. My email is alexis.alcott@usu.edu, or you can reach out through the Marriage Commission email, which is marriagecommission@usu.edu. Just email us, we'll get you your certificate and that survey so that you can get your CEU credit for today's certification. We'll now turn the time over to Andreas for their presentation.
Thanks, Alexis. Hi, everyone. I am so glad to be with you all. I'm so excited to be sharing this space together. Yeah, just really honored to be here. Wanted to, as kind of often I do whenever I give like presentations or trainings, or even when I'm doing therapy, want to invite us to spend a couple moments and get grounded and to really set some intentions for this space. So those who are willing, wanting, and able, I want to invite you to gently and softly close your eyes. Maybe you lower your gaze, or maybe you find a fixed point on the wall ahead of you. And take a couple deep breaths, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. Breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. And one more time, breathing in through the nose the deepest breath we've done all day. And then breathing out. Allowing our bodies to soften and to rest, dropping our shoulders, relaxing our jaws, easing any tightness or holding in our muscles. As we notice being here in this space, I want to invite us to check in with our heart and our mind. Notice what emotions are present, what thoughts are here, and check in with what could be meaningful from this time together today. What are you hoping to get? What questions do you have? And how do we want to show up in this space together? Without judgment or expectation, just noticing. As you notice that, I want to invite us to notice our external world. Notice any sounds that are present, including the sound of my voice. To notice the temperature in your space. To notice any textures that are around you. To gently and softly open our eyes and notice visually our spaces, different light sources, colors, textures, shapes. As we really allow ourselves to be here for the next 50 minutes or so. Thank you all. Okay, so since my bio was already done, I'll kind of just briefly touch on this so then we can kind of continue focusing on what it is that we all came here to learn about. But my name is Andres. I use the pronouns they, them, or ella if or when we're speaking Spanish. Like Alexis was saying, I identify as queer, as non-binary, as a mezcla bella. I know that's a difficult word to pronounce. It's my way of kind of reclaiming part of my identity as being multiracial. My dad's an immigrant from Guatemala, and my mom's a Western European or strong pioneer stock. For those who are familiar with the pioneers, I come from that lineage as well, which I think is a really interesting, for me, a balance of being both the colonizer and the colonized, having identities that have both been oppressed and identities that are the oppressors. I think that forms a really interesting dynamic for me as I kind of make sense of who I am and how I show up in the world. I currently work at Encircle. Those who are familiar, we're a nonprofit that works with LGBTQI plus youth and families here in Utah. We have a couple of different locations. I feel really honored to be part of a team of really thoughtful clinicians and people engaged in trying to help our community heal. I focused my career on a number of different areas, including queer identity development, which we'll be talking about today, which is essentially how do we form our sense of self, our identity, our self-esteem? How do we make sense of labels? How do we form connections when we exist in a world that has told us that we're wrong, that we're bad, that we're shameful, that we shouldn't exist, that we're unnatural, where we experience a lot of danger and harm? How in all of that do we form our sense of self? So I weave in sociocultural and intergenerational trauma healing because to exist in this world is often traumatic. And again, these are a lot of the things that we'll talk about today. I focus on queer relational therapy and working with QT BIPOC, which is queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our healing journeys. So I do a lot of reclaiming therapeutic practices. So focusing on somatics and attachment-based modalities, EMDR, Latin American-based traditional healing called curanderismo, psychedelic assisted therapy, and part of research out of the University of Wisconsin, Madison, called the Transcare Collective, focusing on work as QT BIPOC clinicians with QT BIPOC clients. I also get to adjunct down at UVU's Master of Social Work program, and at my alma mater, the University of Oregon, their couples and family therapy program. So feel really honored to, like Alexis was saying in my bio, kind of hopefully bridge the gap between research, scholarship, academia, and clinical practice. So here's what we can kind of expect from today. Hoping to kind of touch on an overview of LGBTQ plus foundational knowledge. We'll be kind of exploring what we understand about the social construction of gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, sexual identity, the multifaceted, nuanced approach to sexuality, different relationship configurations. We will be then weaving in some trauma and what we understand about kind of the world that we're in, how we form our sense of self in kind of this environment and our society. And then we'll hopefully focus a lot on kind of the focus being strong LGBTQ plus relationships, talking about the different strategies that we either as people who are part of LGBTQI plus relationships or people who are working with LGBTQI plus relationships, ways that we can form and maintain healthy and strong relationships despite maybe some of the hurdles and the challenges that we have. It is a quintessential Andres thing to over prepare. And so it's also very possible that I have more slides than we have time for. I'm less invested in getting through the slides and more invested in us learning what it is that we're needing to learn today. So like Alexis was saying, if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them, and we can spend time where we need to spend them. I like to really orient to the fact that I've never given this training to this specific group of people, that we're all bringing in our unique experiences, our understandings, our frameworks, our identities here. And so my hope is that we can really collaborate and co-create this space together, that we can make it meaningful for us, rather than, again, me being married to making sure that I get through all 34 slides. Though I'm really proud of myself for reducing my slides to 34. The onboarding process for our therapists at Encircle, I have 204 slides on kind of clinical care. And so feel pretty proud about reducing. So but we will see what we need from this space together. So let's kind of go into an overview of LGBTQ foundational knowledge. First, I want to orient us to the fact that we live in a world full of boxes. That as human beings, as we enter the world, even before we actually enter the world, there are these boxes, these expectations, these structures that exist that orient to how we're supposed to be in the world. So one of the boxes that are present for us is heteronormativity, which is the assumption that the normative, the good, the appropriate, the natural, the moral human experience is heterosexual, that sexual arousal exists in relation to the opposite sex. There's a lot of frameworks and structures that are designed around this assumption, and that this is the normative way to be. So we're put in this box pretty early on. There's also the box of cisnormativity, the assumption that the normative, good, appropriate, moral, natural human experience is that of the binary sex, binary meaning two, assigned at birth, and that's supposed to match your gender identity. And another box that we're often put into is mononormativity, that the best, strongest, most connective relationship structure is a dyad, are two people. And that monogamy is the default or the preferred relationship structure. As a marriage and family therapist, that's deeply entrenched in my clinical training as well, right? This idea that like, oh, the best type of relationship to be in is a romantic sexual dyad. Two people who form a life together, get married, have kids, buy a house, have a white picket fence, have a 401k, all of these things, right? These expectations for us are just these boxes that we're put in. Now, I want to preface that these boxes aren't necessarily being it or having an alignment with any of these boxes doesn't necessarily mean that we're bad. This isn't a critique of this way of life. It is more setting the framework that we're put into these boxes before we really have the opportunity to really explore whether or not these boxes fit for us. So part of what we're doing today is we're really also then talking about how queerness is liberation from these boxes. The term queer is an inherently radical, disruptive word meaning other, different, or odd. It's a reclaimed word, which those who are familiar with reclaimed words know that it's a word that at one point in history was used with bile and venom, was used as a way to put down and oppress and harm a group of people. The intentions were not kind or benevolent. In fact, they're often malicious. But this group of people then take this word and say, wait a second, if we use this word for ourselves, maybe we can disempower that harm. Maybe we can make it so that it no longer causes pain to us if I self-identify with this word. The reclamation of the word queer came about during the Stonewall riots. The HIV/AIDS epidemic comes from an activist group called ACT UP that was really involved in really shedding light on the needs of our community. And so part of that was this reclamation of this word queer. As a reclaimed word, it's really important to note that not everyone has the same relationship with the word. That people who maybe experienced some of the harm that experiences it as a venomous word maybe feel less attached to that reclamation process. But as a community and as scholars, we often use LGBTQIA+ and queer interchangeably as these umbrella terms, as this umbrella category for variations in gender, gender identity, gender expression, in sexuality, in relationship and relationship configuration. So you'll see that I'll use it interchangeably today. But I want to note that when referring to a person, really important to listen to the language that they use and not impose a word that potentially could be harmful for them. And again, it's the tricky balance with reclaimed words where using it as an in-group versus an out-group. So if you're an ally versus a member of the community, there are maybe different considerations and parameters with the use of this word. But when we talk about scholarship, we talk about it in terms of things like queer theory. And so it is a pretty common word to be used when talking about kind of the idea of disrupting boxes, being radical against maybe prescriptions or ideas, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and mononormativity. It's important to note, though, that much of what we categorize as queer stems from breaking free of these imposed boxes, but the only reason why we would ever need to break free is because we were put in boxes in the first place. And so there's this pairing that's really tricky, which is queerness only exists because of heteronormativity. We only need to liberate because we've ever been caged. And so part of the hope, I think my larger vision, is that we work towards an environment where we remove the cages and the boxes actually, so that we don't ever have to liberate ourselves. But for the time being, we continue to exist in this world where liberation is essential for our well-being.
We have a question.
Okay.
This viewer says, what does research say about how effective non-monogamous relationships are? I just haven't read very much about open relationships or throuple relationships, and I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, what a great question. And I think one of the things that could help us with that is there isn't as much research as I think we would like, partially because of the mononormativity that exists in scholarship. And so often, in order to research something, first we have to acknowledge that maybe that something could be potentially beneficial. There's a lot of bias that I think goes into research. For instance, we also have pretty limited research when it comes to things like queer identity development, partially because homosexuality was considered a pathology in psychological circles. It was considered a disorder up until the 70s. So we actually only have a couple of decades where we even considered that being homosexual, being gay, being lesbian wasn't something to be fixed or remedied. And so what we do see from the research is that it's less about the relationship configuration and it's more about the principles upon which that relationship operates that makes the difference between a connective and a healthy relationship and a disconnective and unhealthy relationship. And so we see that a lot of the things that are pitfalls in monogamous relationships, in dyadic relationships, hold true in non-monogamous and non-dyadic relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those pillars, but that is a great question. There's some good books, which maybe I will kind of have a reference list that I use as far as really good beginning places to understand a little bit more about non-monogamy frameworks and to deconstruct this framework that monogamy is the default, the best, the most stable, those type of things. Great question. Yeah, thanks for asking. Okay, so another piece of this, right? So as we're talking about this umbrella, now we get to maybe dive in a little bit to gender and what we understand about gender. So gender is a social construct, which means that we created it. We as human beings, for a lot of good reasons, try to make sense of our world. And so what we've done in this society is we've said, oh, there are these traits, these roles, these personalities, these behaviors, these expressions that we are going to categorize as either masculine or feminine. We're going to create this dichotomy, this binary, this mutually exclusive experience. In a lot of ways, this compatible, but also sometimes contradictory or against. Within that, we then have what we would call gender identity, which is this internal sense of self that's attached to these traits, these roles, these personalities, these behaviors, and these expressions. So as we've created these social constructs of masculinity and femininity, we as human beings then say, oh, am I aligned or not aligned with these constructs? Does this make sense for me? Does it feel good? Does it feel congruent? These gender constructs are not biological or chromosomal. I have yet to see any research that supports that liking the color pink, it is at all connected to biology. That wearing eyeliner is at all chromosomal in any way, shape, or form. So that's the really important distinction that we can often see conflated. And speaking of biology, even biology is not as binary as we often have been taught. I'm not a biologist, and so like all of those features, I want to be careful kind of to stay kind of within my scope of practice, but we see research that continues to support and evidence that even biology is less binary than we ever thought. The intersex community is a real strong community that's really advocating for recognition, acknowledgement, and shedding light on some of the historical traumas that have happened to people as far as surgeries being done on young humans in order to have them fit in this biological binary that, again, we also created. But gender, going back to gender, again, are these social constructs. We have this internal sense of self that then as human beings, we're communicative, we're social, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And so we find ways to express ourselves in gendered ways. It's this external enactment of gender, which can be clothing, aesthetics, gestures, which is interesting. It's kind of connected to some of the source of my trauma growing up. But I remember I used to get asked a lot to check my fingernails because apparently that somehow had a connection to my sexual orientation or how feminine I was. And so there's these gestures, how we sit, whether we sit cross-legged or not. Again, things like whether or not I put a black line over my eyelashes in order to kind of create a swoop, whether or not I know how to contour, are all pieces of kind of this gender expression. It's important to note that sometimes these are aligned and sometimes they're not. And so sometimes somebody can have a gender identity that they then express themselves in a different gender way, and that gets to be valid and important, and doesn't negate their gender identity. Again, I think the important piece of this is so much of this is socially constructed, which means that we can deconstruct, and it also means that we can reconstruct. So you may have heard some things like gender is a spectrum, but more and more we're moving away from spectrum language because that continues to imply these opposite ends of a line, of a spectrum. And it implies that movement towards one is movement away from another. So for people like me who feel that I can hold both my masculinity and my femininity together, that having a mustache and mascara actually can work really well together, the spectrum has me have to choose. So more and more, the language that we're using are things like a map or a constellation or a configuration or a collage of these traits, these roles, these personalities, behaviors, and expressions. It really gets to be a practice of being a both and rather than an either or, which I think is a really beautiful, exciting, liberatory experience for us.
We have a question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, ready for it. Nope, go for it.
Their question is, if this was to move towards a more progressive constellation collaboration, would verbiage used as gender identity change, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Actually, when I was up at Utah State, I spent some time up at Utah State, and one of the theories that one of the professors up there taught me was symbolic interactionism, which is this idea that language is co-created and it's a symbol, which I think is like really interesting. And so as things change, language changes, the symbols that we use to change. And so we are both interacting with a symbol that has been created, this larger sense of gender, and we're contributing to the knowledge of gender. And so as more and more people understand different ways of being, language is going to have to change. And so it's very possible that gender identity, the idea of gender identity, may shift entirely. I'm not sure, but that's maybe my best guess to answer that question. Okay, so continuing on with kind of the foundational knowledge, which again, I could talk for hours and hours and hours just on this. Whole frameworks that go into a lot of these one slides. So also know that this is not meant to be a one and done. This is not meant to be an exhaustive knowledge of everything LGBTQIA+, but to kind of create the foundation for us. So what we see about sexuality is that it's multidimensional, that sexuality is composed of a variety of different spheres or experiences or dynamics, one of which is sexual arousal, the biological, physiological response to stimulus, to something arousing. Things like our pupil dilation, heart rate, blood flow, butterflies in our belly. Those are things that are physiological, and that falls into this sexual arousal sphere. To whom am I sexually attracted? But that doesn't exist in a silo. And so when we're looking at sexual identity, sexuality, sexual orientation, we have to also include the sexual attitudes. What is my relationship with sex? What is my relationship with being a sexual being? What have I been taught about being sexual? Have I been raised in a sex negative or sex positive to say an either or environment, and how does that maybe contribute to my belief about sexuality? It also needs to include our sexual behaviors. What do I do sexually? Part of the reason why these things are distinct and separate is because our sexuality, our sexual identity, isn't determined by with whom we have sex. That people can, for instance, we can often talk about bi-erasure, bisexual erasure, which is bisexuality gets to exist and that identity is valid regardless of with whom you've had a sexual experience. It can include that, but it's not housed in that. So this framework is moving away from a lot of these maybe points that we've used in the past as a singular indication of our sexual identity and saying, oh, actually, it's a combination of all of these things, because we make sense of who we are through our arousals, our attitudes, and our behaviors, which then forms our sexual identity, contributes to kind of the label that we choose and the variations in kind of how we navigate the world, being a sexual being, owning sexual identities. And again, is not a spectrum, even though there are things like, you may have heard of things like the Kinsey scale, which has you kind of put on this spectrum, which again, what we see is that's only one piece of it, right? It's the sexual arousal piece. It's pupil dilation. It's not actually including some of these other things. And so we can also have fluidity and flexibility, movement. It's similar in a constellation. So kind of there was a question about non-monogamy. So here's kind of a foundational overview of non-monogamy. It's an umbrella term for practices or philosophies of non-dyadics or non-two intimate relationships. It can include, but it's not exclusive to, things like polyamory, extramarital sex and connection, group marriage. There can be a variety of different configurations and experiences in this non-monogamy umbrella. It is not synonymous with infidelity, and cheating is still considered a problematic behavior in a relationship, right? Withholding information, consent is pivotal for non-monogamous relationships, or I would say any meaningful relationship, regardless of how many people are a part of it. And some values that maybe you would think of in a monogamous relationship would be things like communication and negotiation, trust, honesty, dignity, and respect, and non-possessiveness, which essentially means that I don't own another person, that I honor another person as a full autonomous being that I am connected with. But again, there's not this ownership component to a person, their feelings, their experiences, but again, in a collaborative way. So it's important to note that understanding of queer identity looks different for different people. I'm obsessed with identity development models, and models can sometimes fail us. Models can sometimes impose this idea of a trajectory on the human experience. And what we see is that queer identity does not follow a trajectory. Some people recognize non-heteronormativity or cisnormativity early in life. There are early signs and they say, ooh, this makes sense for me. Other people, it shows up during puberty. As our bodies are changing, hormones are adjusting, social dynamics are shifting, we say, oh, I think I understand a little bit more about myself. But this isn't the only experience. Some people experience later on in life. We often see that identity development really shows up during transitional times. So it makes a lot of sense that later on in life, maybe you're retiring, maybe you're shifting jobs, maybe you're during like midlife, you say, oh, I'm reevaluating my life. It's non-linear and there is no one way. And it can include a number of lifelong processes that include many events and experiences, like recognizing, owning, disclosing, and incorporating aspects of self into the larger identity. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, or actually we probably won't because I'm mindful of time. But the reason why I put these pictures on here is queer relationships can often include a variety of different identity development processes. And so when my husband and I first got together and got married, I identified as a cisgender gay man. And we formed a relationship under that dynamic because he identifies as a cisgender gay man. As we've gone throughout our relationship, we've been together 9 years, married almost 7. There's been a lot of kind of identity development processes. As I really understood a little bit more about my gender identity, that then created this dynamic where we had to renegotiate and reevaluate our relationship, what identities fit for us, and what type of relationship were we going to form. So it also is important to note that these are not, that if you have a development, say, in one area, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've completed your identity development in another area. And in fact, we never fully arrive at an identity. And so making space for that ongoing nature of relationships are really about kind of building that security to navigate the shifts that will inevitably come throughout our life. Y'all, I'm mindful of time. We are not going as quick as I wanted to, but that is okay. We will honor the process. Maybe we'll go a little bit quicker through this because I'd love for us to spend some time in kind of what do we do as queer relationships. So wanting to note that all of this is happening, all of this conversation about identity development in really unfriendly, unkind, and dangerous environments. Right now, we're currently, the HRC released this, a national state of emergency for LGBTQ plus Americans. There are lots and lots and lots of dangerous rhetoric, conversations, policies, procedures, conversations happening that cause a lot of harm and risk to us as LGBTQIA plus people. It is continually feeling less and less safe to be me in this world, which is important to note that as human beings, we are designed to keep ourselves safe. You may have heard of things like fight, flight, or freeze is an essential part of the human experience and is essential for LGBTQIA plus people, considering that we're in a national state of emergency. However, what we understand about trauma and what we understand about our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, which are our fight, flight, or freeze, is that they're meant to be sprints, not marathons. They're meant to get us away from danger and into a place of safety quickly and efficiently. But we exist in this world where we also need connection in order to survive. So we have this paradox. We're social creatures, meaning we need belonging in order to survive. However, we're also activated because the world is dangerous. And so the way that we protect ourselves often means disconnecting ourselves from connection. It doesn't actually make sense if I'm running away from a bear to really consider the bear's feelings and bear's thoughts and being curious about the bear's story. I'm just trying to get away, right? So part of our brain actually shuts down. So there's this paradox that often exists for us. So we often see that we as queer people, we don't grow up as ourselves. We show up playing a version of ourselves and we sacrifice authenticity to avoid pain and difficulty. And so we often then experience this ongoing task of trying to figure out who are we in all of this, and for the purposes today, how to form meaningful relationships with other people. So given that we're in these prolonged states of risk and danger, needing to play a role, what's the impact of this? It's trauma. We as communities often experience high levels of trauma in that we have higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, non-suicidal self-injury, disordered eating, other risk-taking behaviors. We can experience a lot of discrimination, rejection, harassment, and we can often then have a lack of ability to find meaningful care. We see that not only does it cause us harm, but then it also creates this barrier of who am I going to see to help me with this? If a doctor's not safe, if a therapist isn't safe, if a social worker isn't safe, if a teacher isn't safe, what do I do with that? So there's multiple layers of danger and not feeling safe. And one of the biggest traumas that we see that especially shows up in relationships is this disconnection from our body and our intuition. It's often not safe for us to be embodied. And we have often created real strong strategies to disconnect from our bodies. And so that has impact on us. It shows up in a number of these ways. We disconnect from our body. Sexuality can be a really difficult thing for us because it's often the source of our trauma. For those who were raised in religiously conservative environments, it was our eternal damnation to experience sexuality in the way that we experience sexuality. So of course, we're going to develop strategies to say, ooh, I'm going to repress, restrict, and reduce that. No, thank you. I don't want that. And so even though we come out and we acknowledge aspects of ourselves, that doesn't mean that the strategies that we used instantly go away. So we can have things like perfectionism and scrupulosity, which we can often see is the strategy of, if I can be perfect enough, if I can be good enough, then maybe this piece of myself that disqualifies me for love won't disqualify me for love. So we get really good at performing and being really good. Good little Mormon boy. It was most of my life, actually. I did all the things that I needed to do. We can get really good at this internal guilt and shame. We can feel this sense of needing to hide aspects of self. We can learn to not trust our intuition, look externally, who has the answers, who are the wise people. We can be either hyper or hypo emotional. We can either have a real active emotional range or a really reduced emotional range. Binary thinking, right, wrong thinking. We can have internalized homophobia and transphobia. We can put other people's needs first, especially at the expense of ourselves. And we can form insecure attachment lens, which I think we'll be able to talk about. But I'm going to rush through, y'all. Here we go. So what does this mean for our relationships? We have trauma in our relationships. We've only been legally able to marry in this country since 2015. And so again, talking to research, how can we research queer marriage, gay marriage, if we only have like less than a decade of data points as far as legally, right? We've been forming relationships in a variety of different ways across generations, but that's at play for us, right? This minority stress also shows up in relationships, family and social rejection, ongoing development, like I said, and family dynamics can be unique experiences for us. So what is needed for strong queer relationships? In a nutshell, given that we may not be able to get through all of it, here are kind of my best attempt at saying, what do we as queer people need in our relationships to have strong and healthy ones? The first one is attachment attunement. The next one is connective communication. And the last one is relational resilience. So what does this mean? Drawing off of Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby's work on attachment theory, we can see that as human beings, we have two primary needs: to have a secure base, to know that our primary caregiver is accessible, responsive, consistent, comforting, and caring, and a safe haven, that we can feel competent to go out into the world, to explore, to experiment, to experience, to grow, and that we can come back and be safe and still be loved and experience comfort and care, especially if we're feeling distressed. However, many of us as queer humans have experienced deep attachment wounds. Family rejection threatens our security, and we receive ongoing messages, either direct or indirect, of non-security and unlovability throughout our life. Things like turning off the TV when two gay men kiss. Boom, sends me an indirect message that I'm not welcome in this home. So then we get really good at hiding parts of ourselves. We have strategies, again, like I said, reduce, repress, and restrict aspects of self. But then we often experience this juncture where our worst fears are actually confirmed. We come out and we hear some of the words like, I'm disappointed, I'm so sad. Sometimes we get kicked out of our homes, which then instills in us this, again, this feeling that there are parts of me that make me rejectable and unlovable, which our primary attachment needs is to know that I am not going to be rejected and I am unconditionally loved. So that can alter our sense of security in ourselves. So we can develop, you may have heard of attachment styles. I like to use the word attachment lens because what makes sense for me is that it's the filter by which I view myself and others. It's the lens by which I filter through communication, responses, safety, comfort, desirability, all of that has this lens. And so it's less of kind of an identity and it's more of kind of just the developed strategy I use to make sense of the world and find safety and security. So they're not fixed, they're not prescriptive. So knowing somebody's attachment style doesn't, or attachment lens doesn't say, oh, they're going to do this. It just gives us a better sense of what maybe could be going on. What are some of the wounds that are showing up? So attachment attunement means recognizing, first and foremost, that relationships can be really scary if we've experienced loss of relationship in the past. If we've had to fight really hard to form this relationship, any sort of dynamic within the relationship can actually be really vulnerable and can raise the stakes. And so what's important for us is to recognize our signals of distress, whether I'm needing reassurance, wanting to withdraw, becoming flooded, and understanding that of my partners. Understanding, oh, what could be going on for them? Again, from this attachment lens, recognizing the attachment ruptures that we've experienced. It can add some generosity to some of the things that we're seeing in our relational dynamics. However, it's also important to note that communication is hard across the board. Oh, my goodness. If we as humans could figure out communication, we probably wouldn't need therapists in the same way, right? A lot of my work is working on communication patterns and dynamics. And for LGBTQI plus relationships, there are lots of opportunities to have to practice really good communication because so many of the scripts actually don't fit for us. One of those was, which isn't exclusive, isn't just in LGBTQI plus relationships, but last names. We had to early on have the conversation of, what last name are we going to do? There's not a prescription. Who's walking whom down the aisle? What does a wedding look like? Oh my goodness, how do we distribute labor, right? There's a lot of, I think there's valuable skills actually that every relationship can learn with this level of communication. But for us, we don't have a choice. We kind of just have to have these conversations, and they can attach or they can poke our attachment wounds because we can say, oh no, this is dangerous. Oh no, this is scary. We'll skip over this in the purpose of time. But what's really important for us is instead of just having communication, that we really focus on connective communication. That what we see is that it's not about whether or not a relationship has conflict, but it's how a relationship navigates the conflict that makes the difference. So there are some really beautiful frameworks out there from Gottman's, from Sue Johnson, this idea of 5-to-1 ratio of positive communication, that we're saying positive connective things more than maybe disconnective things. We really focus on I statements and reflective listening, this co-regulation process, that we lean in rather than leaning out, recognizing that even though we're activated, even though it's scary, safety is non-negotiable. So here is where I will wrap up, is one of the most, I think, pivotal things for LGBTQI plus relationships is to have a connective togetherness, to recognize that much of the stress on our relationships come from external sources. So fostering a team framework and approach can really help us increase our individual and relational resilience. recognizing that our hurt and our harm doesn't only happen individually. We all exist in this system that is dangerous and unkind, and that my healing isn't solely my own. That as humans, we're social and connected. So as I heal, so too does my community. So we really focus on this balance between the health of the me being a part of the health of the we, and the health of the we being a part of the health of the me, that they go together, that we actually can't have a healthy we if we have an unhealthy me. So they're pivotal. They hold each other up. And we can do this through things like attachment rituals, co-creating meaning together, play and exploration, moving from fear to play. Whew, can be pivotal in our framework of building a relationship that is based on safety and security rather than insecurity. Community connection, recognizing that we're not alone, that we're not isolated, and this engagement with liberation, this idea that like, oh, we're better together. And so we get to form part of this larger community that's fighting for acceptance, for love, and for liberation. Therapy can also help, though it's a whole conversation about the difficulties within therapy, and those who are therapists would love to keep having these conversations about kind of just acknowledging that our professions have actually been really harmful to LGBTQI plus people, including our history with things like reparative and conversion therapy. And so it's really important for us to be mindful of we need more than just affirming therapy spaces. LGBTQI plus people deserve the highest quality of care, especially considering the level of harm that we've experienced. So part of what I love to do is to train therapists on clinical practices, that clinical lens specifically for us as therapists. And there are certain listservs like the LGBTQ Affirmative Therapist Guild of Utah, which can really help us either find affirmative therapists or be a good referral source for us. That's it. Way over time, but thank you all so much.
Thank you so much as well. We have just a couple questions that have come here at the end. The first one says, I'm two-spirited. Does Encircle work with Indigenous folks?
Yes, what a great question. And I would say yes and no. And part of that is, I think part of my real kind of philosophy or framework is being really intentional. And so for the purposes of time, I have a whole training on QT BIPOC, and part of that is the two-spirit and Indigenous experience is distinct and unique. And so I need to be mindful of not just saying it in word, but in deed as well. Do I understand the unique considerations? Some of us at Encircle do. And some are learning and growing. So I would say yes. Come to us, we'll get you connected to one of us. We practice kind of from that decolonial, non-Western perspective, including things like queerness. Queerness is a white Western concept or word. And so we practice from a multicultural lens. So that was a long answer to say yes.
Perfect. Our next question is, how do you help a queer couple? Sorry, I have a little bit of cough, so my bad. Sorry, audience. How do you help a queer couple that has one leaning in and the others leaning out?
Oh, what a great question. And I think we have a lot of maybe therapeutic modalities that can kind of help with that. As I think about things like Sue Johnson's emotionally focused therapy, really talking about kind of the pursue or withdraw kind of dynamic and these primary versus secondary kind of emotions and deepening questions and conversations, and the role of the therapist in really facilitating an environment in which the relationship can start leaning more into each other rather than the dynamic of kind of that. And so I would say maybe drawing from some of the modalities that we see whenever there's a pursue withdraw, a lean in, lean out, with special consideration for maybe some of the dynamics at play or the reasons for the lean in and lean out, that trauma lens or that yeah, identity lens maybe could be really helpful. So really being clear on what's going on with the relationship maybe could be a helpful place to start.
Thank you so much. And just additionally, if you're looking for more resources, we have another webinar that was done by Tyler Patrick just a couple months ago that talks about shame resilience. And he talks a lot about the leaning in and leaning out. So if that's something that you as a listener are more interested in learning, please hit that up. Um, and then our last question is, how do you help couples that may,
Mm.
after being married for a long time, like you and your relationship, alter their journey in sexuality or gender and just helping them along that journey?
Oh, what a big question. But let me see if I can distill it in something. I think normalizing the ongoing identity development process is a really helpful thing. Um, I think in any relationship that who I married is not who I'm married to. That there's a kind of an expectation that I have that my husband is going to learn and grow, is going to understand more about who he is as a human. And so um my maybe commitment to the relationship is not a commitment to a stagnant human, but a commitment to that ongoing relational rupture and repair process. So that's a lot, I think, of what I do as a therapist is really normalizing that, making space for that, and again, really seeing what works and what doesn't work. One of the things that maybe I want to name is I am not invested in keeping relationships together just for the sake of relationships being together. So part of my deconstructing is saying some relationships do not last a lifetime. And that doesn't mean that they're any less valuable or any less meaningful. And I don't think that my job needs to be to make sure that every single relationship that I see as a therapist stays together. Part of my job is to help empower relationships to make decisions that best fit for them individually and as a relationship. I hope that that made sense.
Thank you so much.
Of
And
course.
just this presentation has been amazing. I wanted to give you just
Mm,
a little bit of time here at the end that if any of our viewers want to stay
mm.
connected with you, how can they reach you?
Yeah, what a great question. Yeah, so I just made a website as far as a way to kind of filter through the different things that I do. And so feel free to visit me at andreslariusbrown.com. There's a contact form where you can either request specific consultation, any specific training, curiosities about maybe where I'm presenting at different places, and um, I do therapy in a limited capacity at Encircle because of a lot of my administrative tasks. So I'm not necessarily able to kind of provide therapy, but helpful or willing to help people get connected. We have plenty of therapists at Encircle that are wonderful, great, skilled, trained. So that would probably be the best way to stay in touch is reach out there. Would love to stay connected.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for being here today and for your questions. And especially thank you, Andreas, for your
Oh,
time being here and presenting on this.
oh,
I know I, as well as many other people that are saying in the comments, have learned so much and are very grateful for you taking this time and sharing your experience.
oh.
Um,
Well, it's my honor. Thank you.
Once again, if you attended this webinar as we close out for that CEU credit, please make sure to stay on until the very end of the webinar. The survey needed for your certificate will automatically load onto your screen. And then you'll get an email from the UMC email with your certificate. If for some reason it doesn't load, don't panic. Please just email us at either my email, which is alexis.alcott@usu.edu, or marriagecommission@usu.edu. We'll give you the survey link and you'll get your certificate right away. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope that you have a great rest of your night.